Time is currently 1:32 p.m. on Thursday, March 18th, 2021. Present today we have Representative Thompson, Representative Carpenter, Representative LaVaughan, Vice Chair Ortiz, Co-Chair Merrick, Representative Rasmussen, Representative Josephson, myself, Co-Chair Foster. We don't have any of our finance members online, so I don't believe Elena is on there, is she?
Representative Johnson?
Representative Johnson, are you there? I believe she should be online. She just died. Oh, there you are.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Representative Johnson is also online. And just a reminder as we start, if folks can mute their cell phones. Today we have 3 items before us. First, we're going to hear a presentation on a reverse sweep from Neil Steininger, Director of OMB. And then I'll turn the gavel over to the co-chair, where we will be taking up HB128, which is the use of internet for charitable gaming, and also we'll be taking up amendments for HB76, which is extending COVID-19 disaster emergency. So with that, Mr. Steininger, if you could come up and put yourself on the record, and we'll just, this is one of those issues that gets folks every year, and that is how the reverse sweep works, what the reverse sweep is, and so we just wanted to try to keep it fairly short. I think maybe keep this to no more than 20 minutes. We do have, like I said, the other 2 bills that we need to get to today. So with that, Mr. Steininger.
Good afternoon. For the record, Neil Steininger, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. So just for a little background to get towards the discussion on the reverse sweep. So the Constitution of the State of Alaska addresses 3 distinct funds. One being the Permanent Fund in Article 9, Section 15, one being the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund in Article 9, Section 17, and one being the General Fund. Each of these funds have different restrictions on them, the General Fund being just a general concept of all those things not fitting into the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund or the Permanent Fund. Each has restrictions. As I said, the Permanent Fund has specific revenues deposited in, and only the income of that fund may be appropriated. The Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund includes money received from the termination of administrative and judicial proceedings involving mineral revenues, and this really is where the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund is where this concept of the sweep comes from, so we'll go into that in a little more detail. And then the General Fund is money received from taxes, fees, and other sources not constitutionally directed to the CBR or the Permanent Fund. And that includes all of those designated General Fund various accounts that we use in the state budget system.
I just want to note that we've also been joined by Representative Edgman and Representative Wool. And let's see here. I think I had something else. Maybe not. Mr. Steininger?
So a little more detail on the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund. This is a reproduction of Article 9, Section 17, which was added to the Constitution in 1990 via an amendment. The subsection that pertains to the issue at hand today, the sweep and the reverse sweep, is subsection D, the repayment requirement. So what that subsection says is that if an appropriation is made from the Budget Reserve Fund, until we've repaid those appropriations, any amount of money in the General Fund available for appropriation at the end of each succeeding year shall be deposited into the Budget Reserve Fund to pay back that debt. As everyone in this room is aware, over the last decade we've drawn a considerable amount from the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund in order to meet state needs and to fill a structural deficit. As a result, we have a significant debt to the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund, which results in the triggering of this repayment requirement on an annual basis. So the repayment requirement is what's commonly called in the budget world the sweep. Between fiscal years 95 and fiscal year 2010, that requirement was also triggered. It peaked at a $5.2 billion debt in fiscal year 2005, which then began to be repaid and was fully repaid in fiscal year 2010. Our current debt began in fiscal year 2015. We now owe greater than $11 billion back to the Constitutional Budget Reserve. A little bit on the mechanics of how the sweep actually gets executed. So the sweep is effective on midnight of June 30th of each year. So any balance in an account midnight June 30th of each year would be swept to the Constitutional Budget Reserve. It's reversed through the reverse sweep pending a 3/4 vote of the legislative body and signature by the governor in an appropriation bill. And that reversal happens at 12:01 a.m. on the following day. And that's, the theoretical idea behind this. But the actual mechanics, because the state's accounting systems aren't closed exactly at midnight, we have 2 months opportunity to effectively do cleanup to ensure that all of the accounting transactions are in the right place, being made to the right funds. We've accounted for all payroll, all bills that are pending and being received. We have until August 31st to actually close out the prior fiscal year. So while we're working on closing those accounts out, we're not executing on that sweep transaction until that has been completed. Then those balances are subject to audit and review by the Division of Finance. So as they're preparing the annual comprehensive financial report, they're looking at the balances of those accounts and determining the amount that actually was available in those accounts and subject to the sweep at midnight on June 30th. So the actual mechanics of this happen much, much later than that June 30th date, but it is based on the amounts that were in theory there based on accounting transactions at that time. So how do we decide and determine which funds are actually subject to the sweep? So when we look at that, we don't have a terribly large amount of guidance on how to interpret that constitutional provision. So we have to sort of set a test to apply to different funds to understand, should we apply the sweep to them and count them in that amount reported in the annual financial report. So what we look at are funds that are subject to sweep are generally funds for which the legislature has retained the power to appropriate and that are available to pay expenditure and that are not available to pay expenditures without further legislative appropriation. So that means, funds that are available during the budget process, but that do require appropriation. Also, funds that list purposes for which the money in the fund can be used, but still require appropriation. So you can see that rule, really it comes down to that availability of appropriation by the legislature. Things that are not subject to the sweep are money and funds that are already validly appropriated. So these would be obligated funds. The sweep wouldn't defund an existing capital project because those monies have already been validly appropriated. Also, federal funds aren't subject to the sweep. So we have, strings that tie our hands in terms of how that money can be used. And generally speaking, the federal government wouldn't allow us to deposit those monies into a state savings account. Other trust funds with a obligation behind them, such as the Public Employee Retirement Fund, or other funds that can only be used for a specific stated purpose under law or held in trust. Additionally, donations, because those donations usually come with strings attached from the person who donated the funds. They're donating them for a specific purpose. Also, accounts or funds subject to expenditure without appropriation. So this is what we usually call capitalized funds. These are funds that an agency or an entity in the state can spend without further appropriation when a need arises. And then also receipts subject to refund. This particularly impacts the Alaska Marine Highway System or university tuition, where the entity may be required to refund those fees at a later date. And so that wouldn't be subject to the sweep because there's still an obligation against that money until the time such that that refund is not available. So the sweep reversal is an action taken annually in the state's operating budget or capital budget, depending upon where it falls in the legislative process. This year, we've proposed a reverse sweep in Section 28A of the Governor's proposed fiscal year 22 operating budget. The language you see here is the language from the budget that implements that sweep. What the language is saying is that any monies that were swept from a fund or from a sub-fund of the general fund or an account within the general fund, those amounts are appropriated back to those funds from the Constitutional Budget Reserve. And so technically speaking, this is a draw from the Constitutional Budget Reserve, and so requires a 3/4 vote of the legislature. Again, this is commonly called the reverse sweep, and what this really does, the intent behind this appropriation, is to prevent a lot of these programmatic problems that can be caused by emptying of these various funds and sub-funds and accounts within the general fund. So a little bit about those impacts. If reversal of the sweep is not enacted, there are sort of 3 categories of impacts. There are high impact funds, and these are funds that don't have revenues projected to come in during fiscal year 22. The biggest here really are the scholarships coming from the Higher Education Fund, and then any appropriation being made from the Power Cost Equalization Fund. Those 2 funds, the Higher Education Fund and PCE, both don't receive revenues on a fiscal year basis. They are savings accounts set aside in prior years by the legislature that produce income that provides for the cost of certain state programs, such as the Power Cost Equalization Program and scholarships to students. Medium impact funds are funds where they're receiving revenue in the next fiscal year, so there will be money to back some of those appropriations. However, that revenue is less than the amount being appropriated in fiscal year 22. Some of these programs include things like the Alcohol Safety Program, Chronic Disease Prevention within Department of Health and Social Services, Substance Abuse Grants, Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention Programs, the Marine Highway System Operations, as well as Spill Prevention and Response within the Department of Environmental Conservation. All of these programs have revenue coming in the next fiscal year, but that revenue is not sufficient to cover all the appropriations.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Josephson?
Through the chair, Mr. Steininger, the last clause there, and spill prevention and response, in the most important case describing the sweep, which is called Hickel versus Cooper, the Supreme Court said very expressly that the response part of the fund is fully appropriated. That is, you need it at a moment's notice. And essentially that's because of the Exxon Valdez. That's what created that. So are you sure that should be on your list? Because we've spent it.
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, and thank you for bringing this up, because this is one of those areas where there's strange technicalities to the way that fund is filled effectively. So the spill prevention and response accounts are filled with surcharges on fuel, but those surcharges during the fiscal year are held in an account within the general fund, and then in the following fiscal year we appropriate into those accounts the amount collected in the prior year. But that appropriation into the account happens July 1st, and the sweep happens on June 30 and is subject to that holding account where the revenues are placed. So because the way that the money appropriated into the response account, because of the mechanics of that appropriation, the response account itself isn't subject to the sweep. So any money that was placed in there in that prior fiscal year, that wouldn't sweep. It's the revenue collections from the year that were about to be deposited into the fund that are subject to the sweep. It's a little bit of a technical timing issue because, yes, the response account itself, not subject to the sweep. As you said, it's fully obligated. Revenues going into that account, however, are impacted by the sweep. And so there are some of these areas, this one in particular is probably the most complicated of them, but there are some of these areas where there's unforeseen circumstances where you may have a fund that at surface level appears to be completely outside of the scope of the sweep, but is impacted by other things that happen should the sweep not be reversed.
Maybe if we could let Mr. Steininger finish up here. We're just one or two slides in, and then we'll take questions. Mr. Steininger?
Thank you. And the final category really are those funds where there is no real immediate impact, and that would be areas where the FY22 appropriations are, not reliant on existing balances. Primarily, these are accounts that are just holding accounts for revenues that get used for specific purposes, but don't have ongoing reliance from a specific program on that account. So looking at a non-comprehensive but high-level summary of some of the impacts from if the sweep occurs and is not reversed. This table gives you dollar value shortfalls of several funds where there's significant impacts to the FY22 budget should the sweep not be reversed. Again, this is not comprehensive, it's just sort of the largest dollar value places where we see pretty significant programmatic impacts. I already discussed power cost equalization as well as the scholarships from the Higher Education Fund. You also have a lot of these use taxes such as tobacco use and education cessation that are directed towards programs that are prevention and public health in nature, or things that address domestic violence, substance abuse, or education-related areas. We also have some industry impacts like the Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission Fund, where you would see a shortfall in the fiscal year 22 budget as well. But the important thing to note is these impacts are mitigated through enactment of Section 28A of the governor's proposed operating budget.
We'll take questions at the end.
And that's the end.
So thank you very much, Mr. Steininger. I just wanted to do this as a refresher for everyone, just to bring us all back up to speed on that. Glad to see that the governor included the sweep language in his budget, so that's great. Didn't mean to have this before us in terms of us arguing what we think should be included and the administration thinking what they should be, included. So I didn't necessarily want to go down that route. But I think bringing up some of the valid points just to let folks know what the issues are, I think is definitely valuable. So with that, we've got three people in the queue here: Representative Laban, then Ortiz and Josephson. Representative Laban.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on slide number 7, it caught my eye, the Alaska Housing Capital Corporation. So is that fund not subject to sweep because it's what is called a capitalized account?
Through the chair, Representative Laban, actually we have that categorized here as a fund subject to sweep but without any material impact on the fiscal year 22 budget. So the Capital Corporation account is a count at Alaska Housing Finance. However, they're not able to spend from it without further appropriation, and it doesn't meet the other categories that would take it out of the scope of the sweep as we see the guidelines.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So it would be subject to the sweep. So what would be an example, if I may follow up in my last question, what would be an example of capitalized account that's not subject to the sweep?
Through the chair, Representative Laban, a good example here would be the vaccine assessment account or the vaccine purchase program, the account that funds vaccine purchase, bulk purchase of vaccines. So we receive payments in from entities, we pool those resources and purchase vaccines. The payments in our general fund revenue, but then we capitalize that account and we allow the Department of Health and Social Services to spend without appropriation to make bulk purchase of vaccines to bring that cost down for the state. So that would be an area where you have a capitalized account not subject to the sweep.
Thank you.
Representative Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going to slide 4, under the category of those funds subject to the sweep. Since we began the process of the sweep and reverse sweep, I think it started to look like the previous slide said around 1995, have we always, in a functional way, swept every fund that is subject to a sweep, even though we had maybe the authority? Was that process always taken with every fund? Those that were deemed sweepable were swept?
Through the chair, Representative Ortiz, in effect, yes, on paper. We don't, because the sweep is reversed, and because of the timing, we don't actually move the physical dollars on June 30th and move them back July 1, especially since we don't know the amount subject to the sweep at that date. So the sweep doesn't ever actually occur. There's not, actual movement of money across these accounts, but we do, do the calculation of what would have been swept. It's an important part of that annual financial report for them to be able to give that accounting balance of the CBR, post-sweep, pre-reverse sweep. So it's not physically moved, but they are swept in the sense of the calculation is done.
So in, again, I guess in a functional way, there hasn't been any broadening of the category of those funds over the years that are subject to the sweep. In other words, those funds were always been subject to the sweep, and there hasn't been any broadening of categories of funds that have been subject to the sweep. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Representative Ortiz, I understand the question a little better now. So the funds subject to the sweep and the determination of the funds subject to the sweep has shifted with different understanding over time as different people have looked at this. And really in prior years, 95 to 2010 and prior to a couple of years ago, generally speaking, with a couple exceptions, the sweep is reversed timely. There's been a couple of years where it hasn't. Several years ago, we were in a time period where it was not certain that the sweep would be reversed. And so in order to ensure that we were actually implementing this provision correctly, should we have to, we knew we needed to review what had been looked at prior and ensure that it was being done properly. So that interpretation, there are funds that prior people may or may not have considered, but because it was always an academic exercise, it was never really reviewed with a level of rigor that necessarily, laid out the exact standards. Like I had said earlier, we have very little guidance to go on in terms of what is and isn't sweepable. And so, reviewing that with rigor when it looked like it may need to actually be implemented was something that was important to ensure it was faithfully executed.
Final follow-up?
Representative Ortiz.
So along that same line then, that review has always been done by each administration without necessarily legislative input on that review process. And to be more specific, has power cost equalization and higher education fund always been swept in the history of the sweep, or are those recently new categories that have been deemed sweepable?
Through the chair, Representative Ortiz, higher education fund and power cost equalization were, recently determined to be sweepable. They weren't necessarily considered that way before, but I'll also say they weren't necessarily reviewed with rigor since there wasn't a practical impact of a misdetermination of sweepable funds.
Okay, we've got three people in the queue here. So I'll take these next three questions and then we'll move over to the two bills we've got. So the three I've got here in the queue, Representative Josephson, Representative Carpenter, and Representative Edgman. Representative Josephson.
Thank you, through the chair. On the last subject, Mr. Steininger, the power cost equalization, in the same case, Hickel versus Cooper, they say, perhaps not completely definitively, but they speak to power cost equalization. They say it's at least nominally housed in the Alaska Energy Authority. And because it's held in a corporation, and I've read Hickel versus Cooper very, very carefully, but not in the last several months, but I did this past fall. And essentially the implication is that's not sweepable. That's our attorney, although she says it's a close call, she comes down, I think, on the side that it's not sweepable, but the administration thinks that it is sweepable. And I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, first of all, it strikes me that if it were permanently swept, there would surely be litigation. But shouldn't either the executive branch or the legislature write a law so that we would at least know what's sweepable and what's not? Because, and I'll just say that the case of Hickel versus Cooper, the Supreme Court says, we don't like your first try at it, but do try again. And the CBR constitutional provision also says, as prescribed by law. So I know that's a lot, but...
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, kind of avoid legal arguments since I'm not an attorney. What I will say is, the most recent Attorney General's opinion on this matter, is sort of what I have to go on in executing, my job as OMB director, and that determined that PC was sweepable based on the analysis of the information we have. To the question of whether or not there should be a law, it certainly would help some of that, guide some of that interpretation. As I mentioned earlier, there's very little to go on in terms of how to determine sweepability. But at the end of the day, what is and isn't sweepable with some of these kind of hotter topic funds, there are many, many funds and many programs within the state budget significantly impacted by the sweep. So the policy position of whether or not to reverse the sweep and its impacts on state budget and state programs doesn't really change depending upon the outcome of some of the arguments about some of these kind of higher profile sweepable or unsweepable funds. So the importance of that reverse sweep really isn't, I'd say the importance of the budget item that we're discussing today doesn't change based on that determination. It's still a very important budget item, an important thing to enact for the health of state operations. And I know that wasn't really your question, but I just feel that that's an important thing to note when we're discussing this fund by fund categorization of sweepability.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Representative Carpenter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So slide 8, if you would. So if you can help us understand the programs that are represented by the dollar figures there, when you say that they will be unfunded or not funded, that is because at some point in time the legislature has created a program in statute or whatever to fund that program from a specific account. And with the sweep happening, that account is empty. And therefore that automatic programming thing that was created doesn't work anymore because there's no more money there. But if the legislature were to reappropriate or create law that says that program will now be funded through a different account, then it wouldn't be unfunded. It would be funded again. Isn't that correct?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, if instead of utilizing, for example, the Tobacco Use Education Cessation Fund for $2.7 million, if instead of utilizing that fund, instead an unrestricted general fund appropriation were to be made to those programs, then yes, that impact would go away. But it would require $2.7 million appropriation of general fund, which is what this chart is looking to illustrate.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So for your example in the tobacco use education and cessation, why don't we just say that's an important program to us, and these accounts and the money that's in it, it just needs to be there forever, and we're going to just fund that program through those accounts in perpetuity because it's an important program to us. Why don't we just do that?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, I think that's really a policy decision for the legislature to make.
Now, I believe we can't do that. We're constitutionally prevented from doing that. That would be a dedicated fund. These are designated funds because they have to be re-appropriated every year. We don't have the authority to say the tobacco use and education and cessation program is mandatory and it must be funded from this account every year. We don't have that authority constitutionally.
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, what I mean to say is the policy decision would be whether or not to use tobacco education cessation fund or to use general funds to support that program. The policy of what fund to use for a given appropriation is the legislature.
Do you happen to know, last follow-up, do you happen to know what percentage of the funds that are swept are represented by the numbers that are there?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, actually we have a handout in your packet that lists the total amounts of funds that were swept in at the end of fiscal year 20. It totals about $1.5 billion.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, last question, Representative Edgman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Not a question, but just a statement. I would hope at some point, because this vote on the House floor, which requires 30 members and a full 15 on the other body to achieve a 3/4 super majority, could largely be a roadblock for us getting out of Juneau. But I would hope at some point we could, and I've watched these explanations in the other body's finance committee, and I've watched it here, and nobody understands this really. It's like oil taxes or education foundation formula. Maybe a handful of people really understand it. But to go back into time and understand the context for why the CBR was established and what sweepable meant back in 1990 when this was created. And I was just texting with a couple of former staffers who were helping me kind of go through the history. The statutory budget reserve was founded, I think, in 1986, but the super vault concept called the CBR was established in 1990 to be a place where you could park billions of oil settlement dollars that were thought to be out there. And then this all in an era, and I was a legislative staffer back then, when we were struggling with, guess what, not enough revenue, budget cuts, money for a permanent fund dividend, all of that stuff that when oil was $8 to $9 a barrel. So the CBR was created, this whole concept of it being a vault where legislators couldn't get their hands on it because you had to get to a 3/4 majority. And henceforth, all these sort of interpretational items that are before the committee now and are going to be visited later on as we sort of argue about what's sweepable and what's not sweepable via the Department of Law or legislative legal. But I would request for another day, obviously, but some opportunity to have a historical look at this, because there's a backstory that really lends itself to why we're even doing this or what it's about, but why these funds are in or not in terms of sweepable categories. Again, I'll close by saying that this is a great presentation. I think the OMB director did a really good job of laying all this out, but in some ways nobody understands it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Edgman. I do like that suggestion about trying to put this all into context and having a little bit of a historical understanding, and so it's, I think, worth looking at maybe for a future meeting as we move forward here. So with that, I'm going to take a brief at ease, hand the gavel over, and we'll jump into the other two bills that we have. Brief at ease.
This is back on the record. We're continuing this afternoon's meeting with a brief introduction of House Bill 128, Use of Internet for Charitable Gaming, by Representative Fields. Representative Fields, would you and your staff please put yourself on the record and begin your presentation?
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Zach Fields.
For the record, Tristan Walsh, staff to Representative Fields.
Appreciate the opportunity to present this bill to you today. House Bill 128 makes one simple change. It makes permanent regulations put in place during this pandemic to sell charitable gaming raffle tickets online in addition to in-person. Passage of this bill is needed to ensure our many nonprofits can continue to raise money right now but also into the future. It is a timely matter because some of them are planning events right now during this ongoing pandemic. A local business owner suggested this bill to me because these sorts of raffles online are necessary to raise funds for the Anchorage Duck Race, which benefits Excel Alaska and many other nonprofits. However, while this concept was proposed to me by an Anchorage business owner, I think as everyone knows, these kind of charitable raffles occur throughout the state, and I'm just going to give a few examples. Here's the Great Alaska Duck Race downtown, the Kuskokwim Ice Classic in Bethel, the Nenana Ice Classic, and here are some of the beneficiary groups: American Cancer Society, KUAC, the Public Library, and so on. Fairbanks has a rubber ducky race with the Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce. Many sportsmen's groups use raffles to raise money. It's important to note these raffles not only benefit individual groups, but put more money into management and conservation in our community. And I'm just going to pause. CRISA is one of the many groups that buys raffle tickets, and I think this example illustrates why it's important to extend these regulations. This year, CRISA sold raffle tickets online in addition in person, and even though the raffle tickets were available in person at many sporting goods stores like Cabela's, they actually sold a majority of tickets online. So I think what we see from this is, number one, we need these rules in place for our charities to survive during a pandemic. But when we put them in place permanently, we're actually going to raise more money for these very important functions longer term, and that's why it does make sense to make these online raffle sales permanent. Just a few more examples from the Valley and the Alaska Airmen's Association. I promised the chair I would keep it under 5 minutes, so promise fulfilled, Madam Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I know that invited testifiers can also answer questions about specific events.
Are there questions from the committee? Representative LeBon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your putting the Fairbanks Rubber Ducky fundraiser on, and I did speak with the Greater Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce about this, and they're in full support and want my yes vote. I also heard from one of my pull tab operators who's been able to sell tickets online. It's been a boost for his business and indirectly then to nonprofits. So is there a provision in this to make sure that the ticket sales are to Alaskans that are eligible to purchase the tickets, and how do we address that?
Right. Through the chair, Representative LeBon, we simply made permanent the same framework put in place by the governor, which does have that requirement.
Thank you. Further questions? Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I was just curious, I don't know if anyone has had the conversation about it, as to why we wouldn't want people outside of Alaska to purchase raffle tickets that benefit our nonprofits.
Through the chair, I think that's a good topic of conversation that I've had with some groups, and I believe as this bill progresses, we will be able to address it to everyone's mutual satisfaction.
Representative Wool.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative LeBon mentioned pull tabs, selling those on. Is that an activity that's allowed online if this bill were to pass?
Through the chair, short answer, no, pull tabs aren't going to be sold online, but I'll turn to my staff, Tristan, for a fuller explanation. I believe DOR is online too.
For the record, this is Tristan Walsh, Staff Representative Fields. Through the chair, Representative Wool, the language that we have adopted here is following the language in HB69 put forward by the Department of Law and in the bill before the other body. And so on the phone should be Claire Radford with Legislative Legal, and she could speak to that a little bit, but I think the Department of Revenue might also be able to speak as to why pull tabs were not included in their original bill put before the body.
Ms. Glover?
Hello, this is Colleen Glover, Tax Division Director. So the initial language that went into the emergency declaration, some of the public health orders before, was geared towards just the online games, raffles, derbies, and classics. Pull tabs wasn't included. It opens up a lot of other issues about electronic pull tabs and other issues that are kind of bigger discussions that need to occur. So we wanted to limit it to something that was kind of easy to manage at that time.
Follow up?
Thank you. Yeah, I personally don't support online pull tabs, so I'm glad it's not included. I don't really see in HB76 or in your bill charitable gaming, which pull tabs falls under the category of charitable gaming. So this is more raffle, I guess, raffle or lottery.
Madam Chair, I can try to answer that. It's just a different section of statute. AS 05-15-690 vendors are not affected by this bill, so it's just the way that the underlying statute differentiates between those type of charitable gaming operators.
Okay, thanks.
Further questions? Seeing none, we'll move to invited testimony. First, we'll hear from Jason Motika, Downtown Community Council Treasurer and owner of 49th State Brewing Company. Mr. Motika, if you could place yourself on the record and begin your testimony.
Hello, everyone. My name's Jason Motika. I'm a local business owner here at 49th State Brewing Company. We also have operations in Denali Park. I'm also the treasurer of the Downtown Community Council. I'm a volunteer with Excel Alaska and other nonprofits out the state. I'd just like to say, when this whole issue came up, I had brought the pandemic started. Our organization here in Anchorage supported a number of nonprofits that had events at our facilities trying to raise money for their different organizations. And it became apparent very quickly that all these organizations and their fundraising efforts would probably come to a halt, and which has happened, right? And so I reached out to Mr. Fields and Mr. Begich, and I said, is there anything we can do at a community council meeting that we can potentially keep these events going and expand on them? And so they were quickly able to go ahead and facilitate us being able to operate during the pandemic. We actually, increased our sales significantly, and were able to expand this operation throughout the state and sales across the state. And we had a tremendous success in the fact that we brought in a significant amount of nonprofits into this, rave that we had at downtown Anchorage, and we were able to raise, over $100,000 for these different organizations to utilize. Right. So the idea of basically changing this rule permanently, I think, is extremely important given, the uncertainty of what's going to happen with, public events, number one. But number two, and more importantly, Alaska, adapting to rules that other states have in place. These online gaming platforms, the one we use specifically, and I think Ms. Clay is going to testify, and she can go ahead and give you the specifics on that. These are platforms that are being built across the country. They're almost more secure and more accurate for tracking gaming transactions than currently is required. And as the technology advances and organizations throughout Alaska continue to understand how they can use these platforms to go ahead and reach a greater audience, the idea of fundraising is going to change in Alaska, specifically relating to not pull tabs, but the type of lottery that we're doing and these derby races and so forth. I think it is important to distinguish the difference between pull tabs and the events that we're talking about here. I think that is an important distinguish because you do open up different problems if you include pull tabs. But with that being said, specifically related to the events that are being described here, people are testifying on, it provides a tremendous benefit to these organizations and allows the state, in my opinion, to track these changes far more accurately in the future than what is currently, being required. And so I think that's an important distinction to make. And finally, I believe it was Representative Rasmussen who brought up the idea of, why wouldn't we be able to sell to people outside? It's important to know when we started this race originally, the idea was to have it in the summer and sell tickets at different places to tourists, right? Because as Alaskans and Alaskan businesses and organizations, we have a significant amount of visitors that come to this state every single year, right? And so why shouldn't we as Alaskans in Alaska use tourist dollars for money that's outside of Alaska to help fund our organizations and, our projects of what our nonprofits want to go ahead and utilize. So that's all I have to say, and I'm open for questions. I appreciate all you guys do for Alaska.
Thank you. Representative Rasmussen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess just to follow up quickly on those comments, I think that as long as the nonprofits benefiting from the internet, I'm trying to think, raffle ticket purchases are Alaskan, I'm trying to understand why we wouldn't open it up to anybody in the United States to be able to purchase those. So I guess we'll continue that conversation, but I appreciate your testimony.
Representative Wool.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I have two comments. One, the comment Representative Rasmussen just made. Certain raffles, there's a limited number of tickets so that you know you have a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of winning. So that being said, you don't really want to sell 100,000 tickets if you actually want to win. Other than helping a nonprofit, that's great. So some you want a limited entry pool, I would think. And I guess this is a question for Jason Motika, which is he's calling, I guess, on behalf of the nonprofits, but he also owns a business that has fundraisers that he wasn't able to host during the pandemic. However, now with restrictions being eased, and I imagine going into the future, he will be able to host events. And do you think that people such as yourself that have public venues will perhaps see a decrease in whatever foot traffic or incidental business that comes along with the fundraiser or the ticket sales, because people can do it online? In other words, if I'm selling tickets for Nanana Ice Classic, someone might come in my business, buy the ticket, and also buy a sandwich or whatever it is I happen to sell. Do you think there'll be that kind of result from moving everything online? And I know people can still buy paper tickets, but you think it'll have an effect on the brick and mortar businesses that maybe need some of that foot traffic?
You know, Representative Wool, I think that's a great point to bring up, you know, and I think like so many things during the pandemic, there's a lot of questions out there what's going to happen. I will say this, right? The old way of selling raffle tickets with a pen and paper and tracking it and ripping it off and keeping stuff in Ziploc baggies, it's not the most efficient way to do it, obviously. You know, people pay through their phones now with touching a screen. You know, the reality is people are going to want to get together to have events, you know, either which way. I don't think it's going to affect the gathering of having these events, because people want to promote their events. They want to have that social interaction with the organization they want to support. But I think when we have these events and they start up again and we start to slowly see a comeback, I think the technology aspect of what we're talking about is going to create a far greater efficiency for the organization for an in-person event or an online event. You know what I mean? So either which way, you're giving the organization the option of the best way to do it. And like many other things, right, if we don't change this law now, it's going to be another 10 years down the road when we bring it up again, because, you know, at some point, these organizations are going to need the tools to go ahead and keep up with the rest of the country and what these online platforms are allowing them to do from a charitable fundraising effort. If that makes sense. So I appreciate the question. That was a very good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motika. We appreciate your testimony today. Next up is Jamie Claus, Alaska Excel Marketing Director. Ms. Claus, please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. For the record, this is Jamie Claus. I'm the Marketing Director and the Aviation Program Manager at Alaska Excel. We're a 501c3 nonprofit located in Anchorage on the APU campus. We provide educational opportunities to rural students 7th through 12th grade. And in a typical year, we serve about 600 students. In regards to selling online tickets to people outside of the state of Alaska, it also doesn't make sense to me, because the current regulations allow for non-residents to purchase tickets if they're here in the state, but the current regulations also allow for people to buy tickets over the phone if they're in the lower 48. So if you're familiar with the Alaska Airmen's Association raffle, they give away an airplane every year, and 9 times out of 10, it's someone in the lower 48 that purchased a ticket that wins it. Obviously, I'm in support of HB 128, and I believe there's many benefits to the charitable gaming being conducted online. So our organization hosted the Great Alaska Duck Race in 2019, as Jason said, and we sold paper tickets per the regs, and we generated about $30,000. Well, this year, because of the change to the regs, we were able to sell the online tickets. So in 2020, we hosted the race again, and we generated over $100,000. And we included 10 additional nonprofits from across the state who also benefited from those proceeds. We expanded our reach and collaborated with organizations as far as Utqiagvik, which would have never happened if we couldn't be online. So the Great Alaska Duck Race event takes us a lot of time to put on. And if it's limited to selling paper tickets, again, we would really have to take a serious look at whether that would be worth our time to continue doing so. From what I've seen, 11 other states do allow for online gaming, and the American Gaming Association states that in the U.S. it's a $240 billion industry employing 1.7 million people. And right now I share the same opinions as most people that have spoke. I mean, paper tickets are limiting our ability to generate revenue. Paper tickets are more difficult to keep track of and time-consuming, and paper tickets are just outdated. So what I found from using the online ticket system in comparison to the paper tickets was it was super easy to track, it took a lot less time, and data collection was really streamlined, which could, of course, be handed over for state records. So with the temporary change this past year, we were able to include Alaskans from all across the state, and I think our rural communities felt more connected to events happening in Anchorage and Fairbanks, and that feels really important to me. I'm originally from rural Alaska, and growing up in remote areas, it's really easy to feel isolated from events taking place in our state since we're so huge and remote. So I think HB128 is a win for nonprofits, definitely for our organization in comparison the 2020 duck race versus the 2019. And yeah, that's all I have to say at the moment.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We have a question from Representative LeBon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony. And there's a provision under Section 2 that asks for verification of the legal purchasing age, physical presence in the state, and that the individual purchasing the raffle ticket is not purchasing from a location that's not an option for purchasing the ticket, I guess. So I guess my question is, how do we protect the nonprofit organization from exposure if a ticket is sold to an underage individual or somebody from an area of the state that's ineligible to participate in the raffle ticket purchase? And I don't know if Rep. Fields would like to answer that.
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Fields?
Thanks. Through the chair, Representative LeBon, yes, and actually, based on some feedback from nonprofits, we looked around at other states' models, and I think the short answer is we can tweak that language if it's the committee's desire to ensure that nonprofits don't face sort of an impossible burden. Other states have done it, and actually, you would do that at the same time that you would address this non-resident sale issue, because I agree, if someone wants to buy a ticket from, Seattle before they come up here, or even if they don't come up here and support Alaska organizations, why wouldn't we accept their money?
Thank you. Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. If the maker of the bill would be open to it, I would appreciate the opportunity to put an amendment forward for addressing the out-of-state purchasing of tickets.
Through the chair, yes. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Ms. Clayce, for your testimony today. We appreciate you being here. Our last testifier today is Michelle DeWitt, Director of Bethel Community Service Foundation, which runs the Kuskokwim Ice Classic. Ms. DeWitt, please introduce yourself and begin your testimony.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michelle DeWitt, and I'm with Bethel Community Services Foundation in Bethel, and we, by statute, are the entity that sponsors the Kuskokwim Ice Classic. And I've been listening to the other folks testify, and I'm going to share with you that if a raffle is complicated to administer by paper, an ice classic you're about to hear is next level complicated to administer by paper, which is basically the way we're doing it. So I'm highly in support of this bill, and I'm going to share a little bit about what we do and why this will help. The Cusco Ice Classic, it's a small ice classic, highly localized here in Bethel. Alaskans tend to be familiar with Nenana. We operate a very similar contest where customers guess the month, day, and time of breakup of the Kuskokwim River. and it has a very high regional presence, especially here along the Kuskokwim. And we dedicate the revenues from this to nonprofit groups that provide services in our community, but also up and down the river from Aniak to Quigillinuk. We've supported groups. Most of these are youth groups. So we funded our local youth dance group. Our local swim programs have received over $20,000 over the last few years, and on. Youth violence prevention, it's pretty comprehensive. A lot of senior classes in villages and so on. And in pre-COVID times, this would look like youth groups selling tickets in stores to earn money for their clubs or groups, like any kids in your home community selling raffle tickets at stores. But over the years, we're getting this increasing customer feedback from folks either at the tables or who call our sales phone who want to know about purchasing guesses online, and comments on our Facebook page. I mean, it's a very high demand request from our customer base. And, you know, obviously we have to tell folks that we are unable to accept guesses online, but people want that, and in part they want that because it's access, and you can participate when you have time. But from an Ice Classic perspective, it also keeps the control of submitting the guess in the customer's hands instead of relying on a volunteer to write down and submit all of this data on a guess accurately. Now, last year, due to the pandemic, we had to pivot at the very last minute to phone sales only, and that really escalated the need to move to an online format, in my view. Implementing the Ice Classic by phone as the only sales strategy was an enormous burden. It had significant inefficiencies. It has a high risk for errors because at this point now you have volunteers writing down customer guesses that include a month, a date, an hour, a minute, an AM, PM, that's multiple data points, as opposed to a customer writing down their guess. And we had a huge decrease in overall sales. And so I'm going to kind of break this process down for you and so you can really kind of see what we're facing to keep this fundraiser going now because of COVID safety, but going forward in terms of efficiency. So a phone sale, a volunteer, which could be from one of any of 5 to 10 groups, would take down the customer's name, contact information, the month, day, hour, minute, and AM or PM of their guest, details about what youth group they want to support with their purchase. The person on the end of the phone, the volunteer, has to read it all back to make sure it's 100% accurate. And then you have, you know, the name, the address, the payment processing, etc. And then, but that's not where it ends. So we have volunteers working remotely from their homes with the sales phone forwarded to them. And so then we have data at people's homes or at different locations across town. We have to recollect all those forms. The forms have to be transposed onto actual tickets. The tickets then have to be organized and sorted in chronological order by hand. And after all of that, we typically put most of the guesses into a spreadsheet to help troubleshoot and make sure we have things, you know, accurate and sorted correctly in chronological order. It's kind of a fail-safe check. So we did that process 6,000 times over last year for all to benefit our local groups up and down the river so that they can meet their missions. And so basically, we're currently in the year 2021 with all of our advanced technology, but we're implementing this fundraiser as if it's 1980. With phones, with paper, and with individual people chronologically sorting out physical tickets. And House Bill 128 offers a solution for this issue. It allows customers to participate in online sales. It keeps people safer now, which is timely, but going forward, it allows the Ice Classic to reach more customers, expand its reach, and really builds in efficiencies with utilizing the kinds of technology that each one of us embrace every day in our lives to do our job. So I highly support this bill. I hope you do too. I do want to, I've heard a couple of the questions come up around Alaskans and selling to Alaskans versus Alaska-based sales. These are concepts that have been debated a lot. I actually hired an attorney about 5 years ago to closely examine the statute and provide some advice. And the guidance I got, and of course legal guidance can vary depending on who you get it from and how they interpret the law, but his analysis was that much of the burden about the transaction is really on the way the statute currently is. It's really on the customer to assert that, that they're living in a place where they can participate, that they are in Alaska that day, that the financial traction happens in Alaska. And, of course, all of these groups want to recruit friends and family from the lower 48 to participate, and it becomes very complicated. So I would highly support an amendment as well that simply cleans that up and takes the vagueness out of that about whether it has to be in Alaska, whether the point of sale needs to be in Alaska, what that means, etc. So thank you all for listening to me today. I hope you support HB 128, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. DeWitt, for your testimony. We appreciate you being here. Are there questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Representative Fields and Mr. Walsh. We'll continue hearing this bill at a later meeting. I'm going to take a brief at ease before we start considering amendments to House Bill 76. Brief at ease. Finance back on the record. Next, we'll start considering amendments to House Bill 76, extending the COVID-19 disaster declaration. The committee last heard this bill on Monday, March 15th. Amendments were due to my office yesterday at 9 a.m., and you should have received an email yesterday afternoon with the amendment packet. Members will find 7 amendments for consideration before you, and we will consider them in the order that they were received. I'd like to note that Suzanne Cunningham and Commissioner Crum are both online. Should there be questions? And it looks like Andrew Dunmore from Ledge Legal is also going to be available to answer questions. Amendment number 1 is by Representative Josephson. Representative Josephson, do you have a motion?
I do, as soon as I can get the mic. Madam Chair, I move amendment number 1.
Object.
Representative Carpenter.
Can I speak to my motion?
Please go ahead.
I'm hoping, Madam Co-Chair, that this is an amendment that should be agreeable to every branch of government, or at least the ones that occupy this building. So here's what this amendment does. It does what we did effectively on Monday, May 18th, 19th, and 20th last year. So we were sued by Mr. Geldof's client because, put shortly or succinctly, there was a belief that we hadn't followed the RPL process properly. So we came down and we said, we bless the governor's first batch of RPLs. This amendment is fully analogous to that. So what we heard from our council, and what was certainly widely believed in the media and in our communities, was that the governor's extension of the emergency declaration after November 15th was not within his power. And I heard this, all over the place. So what this amendment does is say, we had the power, and future legislatures should know we didn't ignore that we had the power, although we sort of did, but we only did it briefly, because we're going to ratify the governor's extensions. I would think the other occupant of the building, the governor, would like this too, because if there was litigation, this would seem to moot that litigation. So I'm open to criticisms of it, I just don't know what they are yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Carpenter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that the legislature failed to act in the past, and I think we should leave the past to the past and let history reflect what actually happened. And don't think this is necessary. I maintain my objection.
Thank you. Further discussion?
Yes,
Representative Edgman?
Madam Chair, I speak in strong support of the amendment. And speaking of the past, I think it was pretty apparent last November, December, and even into January before the legislature officially convened on the 19th of January, upon the disaster declaration actually expiring on November 15th, the one that we established with Senate Bill 241, there were impediments to the legislature coming together to convene, to declare a disaster declaration, which the law requires. So the governor went on his own and did it, and thought it was a good move by the governor. But two reasons: COVID restricted us from coming down here, getting the necessary 40 out of 60 legislators to call ourselves into session. And in fact, really in November, the legislature probably would have wanted to meet before the election cycle expired, and that wasn't very reasonable either, to get legislators to come down here in the height of the election season. And then in December, during the holiday season, when the COVID situation was even more acute, there was no way the legislature was going to convene or get the necessary votes to call themselves in. So to have this very much analogous to what we did with the RPL process when the legislature itself came back, reconvened in Juneau in late May to essentially authorize what the governor proposed with the RPL process. I think this is a good move for the legislature, and I also would agree with the maker's point that this may offer insurance for the governor were there to be some kind of a litigation in the future. Thank you.
Representative Rasmussen and then Wool.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we have Megan Wallace online?
Yes, we do.
Is it possible? Can I ask her a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We have Andrew Dunmeyer from Legislative Legal. Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Mr. Dunmeyer, could you speak to what this amendment would do in regards to the legislature's ability to bring a lawsuit and whether or not it protects the governor in any way from a lawsuit?
Mr. Dunmeyer?
Through the chair, this is Andrew Dunmeyer from Ledge Legal. Representative Rasmussen, I'm afraid I'm not prepared to discuss that. It's something that I could look into with you, but I think it's something that would require some more research than I would feel comfortable just answering on the fly right now.
Follow up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess to follow up, could you speak then to what this amendment does?
Yes, through the chair, and again, this is Andrew Dunmeyer from Ledge Legal. This amendment would essentially put the legislature's stamp of approval on the 3 disaster declarations that the governor made in November, December, and January during the interim period when the legislature was not in session. And I believe, as Representative Josephson said, the law, as it's written currently, allows the governor to declare a disaster, but it's up to the legislature to extend the disaster. And in this case, the governor made 30-day extensions, again, during interim when the legislature wasn't in session.
Follow up?
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Is this amendment effective regardless of language about an emergency declaration remaining in any amended version of this bill, possibly? I guess to specify, if we take the language out that's currently calling it an emergency declaration, does this amendment still accomplish the same thing?
Through the chair, yes, Representative Rasmussen, this would still accomplish the same thing because it's ratifying the disaster declarations that were made in the past and not anything that's happening right now.
Thank you. Representative Wool?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In reference to the comment about the past being in the past, Representative Josephson today cited a case of Hickel versus Cooper, which was in the past, and it's relevant what happens in the past. It comes up all the time, especially in lawsuits. There's individuals that are suing the legislature quite often for things we do or don't do. So I think this is good coverage, and it basically says the legislature has the appropriation power, and emergency declaration power, and it codifies it, and so I support this amendment.
Thank you. Representative Laban.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess an affirmative vote on this would just be recognition that the legislature has not completely ceded its authority on the action by the governor. And it also will allow the whole body to consider this question once it reaches the House floor as to whether that retroactive authority is appropriate, and we'll see what the rest of us think. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Foster.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm hearing the possible upsides to this, and that is that it could potentially protect us in the event of a possible lawsuit. I haven't heard any downside, I guess, to this, and so I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to put it in. It doesn't hurt, and so I'll be supportive of it.
Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So I had a conversation with Megan Wallace. It's too bad that she's not on the phone to further this conversation or edify the body, but the retroactive nature of this amendment and also the bill before us is something that is concerning. So there's some Supreme Court case law that supports the use of retroactivity within bills, but there's also some exceptions or some constraints that are placed on us in doing so, and the retroactive application of this extension, as long as it doesn't impact substantive rights, is probably okay. But if it does impact substantive rights, which are, let's say, the right to move about the state freely, then we might be in legal jeopardy here. And I've had this conversation with Megan, and happy to share the legal opinion with you all. But I think we may be opening ourselves up to some scrutiny in this regard.
Thank you. Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I think that I kind of agree with Representative Carpenter's hesitation about the lines 4 through 6 on the second page of the amendment. I would like to offer a friendly amendment to this if the maker would be willing to remove that section and just keep everything before it. So just eliminate lines 4 through 6 on page 2.
Representative Josephson.
I appreciate the offer, but I'm not willing to do it.
Can we have a brief at ease, please? House Finance back on the record. Further discussion? Seeing none, Representative Carpenter, do you maintain your objection?
I do.
As the objection has been maintained, will the Secretary please call the roll?
Representative Carpenter. Representative Carpenter.
No.
Representative Edgman.
Yes.
Representative Johnson. Representative Johnson.
Which we're voting on. I'm having a hard time following.
This is
no. I'm voting no. Because I don't know what we're voting on.
Brief at ease. Will the secretary please void the roll? Representative Josephson, amendment number 1.
I move Amendment 1.
There's been an objection. Would you like to speak to your amendment?
Yes. Amendment 1 approves and ratifies the governor's extensions of SB 241's public health disaster emergency, and that's what it does. And our council, our lead council, believes, unless I invite someone to check me on this, but believed that the extensions were illegal. So this would ratify those extensions.
Thank you. Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I think it's just important to note that this does retroactively date the entire bill in front of us to November 15th of 2020, just for representative not in the room.
Representative Josephson.
Can we have it at ease?
Brief at ease. House Finance back on the record. Representative Josephson, would you like to clarify?
Well, I think that the retroactivity extends to Section 2A of the bill. That's my reading of the amendment. And it's designed to merely cover the extensions after the expiration.
Thank you, Representative Josephson. Representative Johnson, do you have any questions?
No, I'm very good, thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Representative Carpenter.
Yes, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. As discussed previously here in the last few minutes, here is a legal opinion that I will submit for the record and for you to read from Megan Wallace. That several pages here, but it says retroactive application of the disaster extension does not appear to affect any substantive rights and is therefore likely to be upheld if challenged. So that sounds like it would support what you're trying to do, but a substantive right, I think, is where Ms. Wallace might be a little off. There are very substantive rights to people in this state who are not able to travel for particular reasons. And therefore, we are potentially opening ourselves up to liability with taking retroactive action in this regard. So you can have it and do what you will.
Thank you. We will distribute that to the committee. Representative Josephson.
I was a bit distracted, but I think Representative Carpenter earlier in the hearing said that our lead counsel had problems with substantive application of the bill, or rather my amendment. And now he's read it to say that she doesn't. And so I want the record clear on this matter. Does our lead counsel, according to that memo, have problems with this amendment?
I'll let you read the memo for yourself. I think she says that she does not, but her argument for why she does not, I think, does not pass muster.
That's a very different thing. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Can we have a brief at ease?
$2 billion of relief money that is about ready to come in the door, washing their hands to the governor already declaring the emergency
House
disaster
Finance
is
back
over.
on the record. Representative Josephson.
Madam Co-Chair, we have before us amendment number 1, and I have quickly read our lead counsel's opinion of the amendment, or at least the topic of the amendment. And fundamentally, she says that the amendment is proper. A court is likely to uphold an extension with a valid retroactive provision. The legislature the provision contained in the measure the legislature uses to extend the disaster declaration, the legislature may do so retroactively. That is not what Mr. Carpenter said before, in the first time he spoke about my amendment. But if the chair is inclined to roll the amendment to the bottom, I don't oppose that.
We have Megan Wallace online. Is it the will of the committee to hear from Megan Wallace or roll the...
Oh, she's online.
Ms. Wallace, are you available? It just went off again. We will go ahead and roll Amendment 1 to the bottom. Amendment number 2, Representative Josephson.
I move Amendment 2.
Object.
Representative Josephson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The SB 241, which passed approximately March 28th, 2020, had 2 provisions in it that that related to liability in a COVID context. Those provisions were in Section 4 and in Section 32. The Section 4 provision regarded standing orders where Dr. Zink or her designee would issue orders on how other providers, that is medical providers, would sort of mitigate their activities to protect patients, among other topics. The bill we have before us doesn't have those standing orders anymore. It stripped that away. So those expired February 14th. It also had a Section 32, which was exclusively about PPE, personal protective equipment, and liabilities surrounding defective personal protective equipment. We don't have that before us in this bill either. What we have instead is some language that was adopted from the other side's SB 56, and that language, I think, has problems. And so when we readopted it in our 76, I think we needed to remedy that. What it says is, a person may not be held liable for an action taken on or after February 14th. So the clock starts on February 14th of this year, and before the effective date of this act. So that's just this tiny window of time if the act passes before soon. So it's a sort of a 6-week window that complies with or does not comply with an order, proclamation, or declaration adopted by the governor to respond to the declaration of public health disaster emergency. And I'm reading from page 10 of our bill. My concern with that is, number one, it uses the term a person, so it would extend liability protection to corporations. That's a concern. The other concern is that I don't know whether, although this bill is about COVID, and I think a court would read it that way, narrowly, the language suggests that anything a doctor did wrong that didn't comply with an order, proclamation, or declaration, he or she could not be held liable for. And I don't think that's what we want to do. So given that we've narrowed the topics of the bill from 241 in March of 2020 to now, I think what we should do is just simply return to what I call the background liability law. That is, how did we treat liability law prior to COVID? And there's been a lot of clamoring that we get back to that world. So arguably this supports that position. So what I'm proposing is simply to delete the language in Section 12. That's what my amendment does.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Rasmussen, do you want to speak to your objection?
Yes, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So I guess to the maker of the amendment, my question is, does this have any impact on somebody at the grocery store who may unknowingly have COVID-19 and infects other people while they're there and they are not able or liable to be sued for spreading COVID-19. Is that?
Representative Josephson.
Through the chair, I'm not a personal injury lawyer. I mean, I dabbled in that, but I'm not one. And so I don't know if a regular citizen without any specific duty, like a common carrier or a business owner, was shopping, for example, at Fred Meyer in Juneau, had COVID, and someone else could prove that they got it from that individual, which would be incredibly hard. I don't know what the law on liability is in that context. I think the proof problem is so profound that liability would not attach.
Ms. Wallace, are you available?
Yes, I'm here, except I missed the question. Could the question be restated?
Yes, Representative Rasmussen.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Ms. Wallace, my question is in regards to Section 12 of the bill before us. And I'm curious what coverage the civil liability extends. Does that include people being held personally accountable for unknowingly passing COVID at the grocery store? If a teacher has COVID at school, are they at risk of a lawsuit from parents because their children get COVID? I'm just trying to understand what that section does.
Ms. Wallace?
Yes, for the record, Megan Wallace, Legal Services Director. Through the chair, Representative Rasmussen, just bear with me, I'm just looking at the language in the bill. The civil liability protection in the bill covers a person won't be liable for action taken on or after February 14th and before the effective date of this act that complies with or does not comply with an order, proclamation, or declaration adopted by the governor. So what that means is that any person who took action between February 14th, when the declaration initially expired, and to whenever the bill before you takes place, they won't be held liable civilly, so through any kind of lawsuit, for action that they took while there wasn't an active disaster declaration or order pending. In other words, there's going to be this gap period between February 14th and when or if the legislature passes an extension of the disaster declaration, and so a person won't be held liable for any conduct that they take in this in-between period.
Follow-up?
So Ms. Wallace, would that include travelers coming into Alaska without testing?
Through the chair, Representative Rasmussen, the current status as it relates to testing is voluntary, and so while there's always a possibility that someone could be alleged in a civil action for their conduct, that the basis of that claim wouldn't be because they violated any kind of order at this point, because the testing it's a recommendation, it's advisory, it's not mandatory. But I don't want to speculate and say definitively that no one could ever be held liable, because if someone, there's always a possibility of that if someone knows that they're ill and engages in reckless conduct, there may be some risk of a lawsuit. So, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Representative Josephson, then Carpenter, then Wool.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I'd like to ask our council a couple questions. The first is, Ms. Wallace, if the legislature passes HB76, or really SB56, with this language, would it be safe to say that the declaration would be ours and not the governor's? Since the governor didn't unilaterally issue this declaration, we made it happen. Of course, he'd sign it.
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, if the legislature were to act on this bill, it would be an extension of the governor's disaster declaration, and under the Alaska Disaster Act, under Title 26, the Disaster Act does not specifically provide for a legislative disaster. So in my opinion, this would be an extension of the governor's disaster declaration.
Follow
up?
On the question narrowly of Section 12, am I right that the way this is written, just for this window from Valentine's Day just over a month ago until whenever this act went into effect, that this is more generous to parties that might harm other people by spreading COVID or by failing to follow an order, proclamation, or declaration than 241? Because 241 had a section on gross misconduct, intentional misconduct. Am I right that when we were more, well, how do I say this? When we were even more intense, I don't know that my statement's true, so I'm not going to make it. My point is that 241 was less friendly to the negligent person than this language. Is that true?
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, I do not have the language of SB 241 directly in front of me, but I do concur. It is my general recollection that the language in 241 was narrower than the provision that's currently in Section 12 of the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Carpenter.
My question was answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Wool.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm trying to understand this section. I guess this is for Megan Wallace, but I understand the gap between February 14th and whenever this bill is passed. And so there's a gap that now is being covered. But if this bill is passed going forward, what is the civil liability clause, or where is it in this bill of this emergency declaration? What is the civil liability? And I guess we're all having hypothetical situations, but if someone goes into a business and the next day they have COVID, or a couple days later, and they want to say, well, I got my COVID at this particular business and I'm going to sue them. Where is there any protection for that business when they say, I don't know how you got COVID, or maybe you got it here, but it wasn't intentional. My employees were wearing masks, or something to that effect, or we were following the local laws at the time. Is that in this, besides the gap between February 14th and whenever this bill passes, going forward? Let's say this bill passes April 1 till say September 30th. What is the civil? What's the liability there going forward? And maybe it's right in front of me and I just don't see it. But I'm concerned about frivolous lawsuits. I'm concerned about people, basically acting in their best manner, but then somehow potentially being sued for it.
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Wool, there is no other liability protection currently in this legislation. And so absent the clause that we've been referring to, a claim would have to be adjudicated through the court system based on our current, set of rules and expectations in terms of conduct. And so any kind of policy decision or desire to extend any kind of liability protections would have to be included or made as part of a separate piece of legislation.
Follow up?
Follow up?
So if this bill were to pass as written and Section 12 remains, is it my understanding that's only covering the gap between the expired declaration and the passing of this new one, and that going forward from the time of this one passing, there is no additional protection or liability coverage?
Through the chair, Representative Wool, you're correct in that this only covers a gap period, and because the bill is retroactive, this makes clear that if someone exercised conduct in this gap period, that they wouldn't later be held liable in terms of whether that conduct was or was not in compliance with future orders or mandates that are issued once the disaster declaration is made retroactive.
Last question. Yeah, so if there's other amendments before us today, and I'm looking at one that does sort of provide immunity from liability, if that amendment were to be included in this bill and the gap was not included, then the gap between February 14th and the passing of this bill, there could be an extra vulnerability that wouldn't be there after the bill passing, assuming this other amendment gets in there. So there would be a sort of period where there's increased vulnerability, say for a business, or increased vulnerability for anybody, for individual as well.
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Wool, can you restate your question? I didn't quite understand what you wanted me to comment on.
Well, if this bill passes today, and let's say another amendment is put in that provides additional, protection, say for a business, not to be sued, and this Section 12 doesn't get in there, then there's a gap period where someone's liability changes between February 14th and the passing of this bill. So there's a window, so to speak, where maybe there's more or less liability. I guess I sort of know the answer, but what you're saying is this bill right now doesn't have any additional liability protection. It just does the gap period with Section 12. So I think you answered my own question.
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Wool, that's correct. And I guess I'll just clarify that it really seems that the intent of Section 12 and the liability provision in front of you is so that if this bill were to pass and the disaster declaration were to be retroactively extended and subsequent health orders or mandates or something were issued in accordance with that extended disaster declaration, that a person wouldn't be held liable for conduct that they did or did not take during that gap period at a time when that mandate or order wasn't being issued. And so I'm not sure that there would be liability in that instance anyways, but this language just clarifies that that person wouldn't be liable for that conduct in the gap period.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you. Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Ms. Wallace, the concept of liability protections, are we talking about protections for rights that you would consider substantive?
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, when we talk about liability or liability protection, especially in this context, we could theoretically be talking about a lot of different liability issues, and particularly in, as was previously mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of people raising claims against other persons or businesses after they contract COVID, in terms of trying to assert negligence or liability as to where they contracted that illness. I don't necessarily think that we're discussing substantive right violations. I think those would be separate, possibly constitutional issues, and aren't necessarily the same kind of liability concerns that are generally being discussed.
I'm a little confused. We're talking civil liability, and you're excluding civil rights from that? That is not going to be what would be covered, or that people would be raising as a thing that we need protection from, is because you violated civil rights?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, the civil liability language in the bill before you protects conduct that was taken that either complies with or did not comply with an order, proclamation, or declaration. A person always maintains the power to raise a constitutional violation and challenge, and someone might assert that liability protects them. I just was articulating that as it related to your question as to the difference between certain kinds of liabilities and those that have addressed or involved substantive rights. I didn't see those as one and of the same.
Well, I follow up, please. I guess I beg to differ that a substantive right in regards to the Supreme Court's decision that we had discussed earlier would most definitely include some sort of constitutional right. And your recommendation to us now through this letter that you, or the opinion that you've given to me, specifically says that retroactive application of the disaster extension does not appear to affect any substantive rights and is therefore likely to be upheld. But we're discussing things that we think we need liability from that most definitely could be some substantive issues, substantive rights, and we have no way to determine right now whether they would or not because we don't have a specific case sitting in front of us. So it appears that we've got some circular reasoning happening here that would put us in some legal jeopardy. And I have to direct our attention to the concept of retroactivity being the cause that the legislature does not have the right to do what we think we are doing right now per the statute. Thank you.
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Carpenter, the civil liability provision in the bill, it's my understanding, is intended so that if a subsequent order proclamation was issued by the governor, that wouldn't be used as a basis as to what conduct someone should have undertook in the gap period between February 14th and when the disaster is extended by the legislature, meaning that a person wouldn't be held to the standard of an order that wasn't in place at the time they took or did not take that action, which someone absent this language might argue that you shouldn't have done X, Y, or Z because that's not permissible under an order that was not in place at the time they did or did not take that action. And so my comments are focused on the liability language in Section 12 and my opinion that you're referencing with respect to retroactivity and substantive rights. Those are separate issues that I was opining on.
Madam Chair. Interesting.
Thank you. We have a question from Representative Laban.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. At the risk of asking this question incorrectly, how does gross negligence play into civil liability in this discussion? If someone makes a good faith effort to adhere to pre-existing best practices, if you will, whether they be part of the law or not, and they act in a gross negligence manner, there would be no civil liability protection for that individual. Would that be correct?
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Laban, the language in Section 12 is currently drafted broad enough that it doesn't make any it does not distinguish between regular negligent conduct and grossly negligent or willfully negligent conduct. So the language in Section 12 is broader than that and could be covered and could be protected under Section 12.
Follow up, Madam Chair. So I guess the thinking behind this question was if someone is intentionally in some manner misbehaving and trying to take advantage, or I guess you can't take advantage of something that wasn't in place at the time of your conduct, there's still a potential for wrongdoing even if we pass this section.
Thank you. Representative Josephson.
Well, through the chair, Ms. Wallace, I don't want to misparaphrase Representative Carpenter, but I think what he might be referring to is, because I think he talked about civil rights. This section, which I don't like, so I don't mean to be defending it too much, but this section wouldn't relate. This section is mostly about torts, right? Which is another term for personal injuries. And if someone refused to wear a mask into a business, and the business said, "Hey, we insist you wear a mask," and was sued, that wouldn't fit. That is not what's in that scenario is not what's meant or described in Section 12, is it?
Ms. Wallace?
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, no, I don't think that that's what this is intended to cover.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Seeing none. Representative Rasmussen, do you maintain your objection?
Yes.
With the objection maintained, will the secretary please call the roll?
Representative Edgman.
Yes.
Representative Johnson. Representative Josephson.
Yes.
Representative Laban.
No.
Representative Ortiz.
Yes.
Representative Rasmussen.
No.
Representative Thompson.
No.
Representative Wool.
No.
Representative Representative Carpenter.
No.
Representative Johnson.
No.
Representative Merrick.
No.
Representative Foster.
Yes.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
With a vote of 4 yeas and 7 nays, Amendment number 2 has failed to be adopted. Briefeties.
Okay, folks out there watching right now, I'm about ready to switch over to Senator Shower's meeting that he's about ready to have. It discusses a brand new bill about the illegal binding caucus rule that they've been using down in Juneau. The Senate is not doing it this year, but these folks in the House in front of us are using the illegal binding
House
caucus
Finance
rule.
back on the record. We've reached our time limit for this meeting. We will recess until tomorrow, Friday, March 19th, after the University Budget Subcommittee. With that, we are at recess at 3:29 p.m.
right, real quick recap. They discussed and talked about the sweep, trying to eliminate the sweep so that it doesn't happen anymore, even though they've got hundreds of millions of dollars sitting inside of that sweep, up to billions, depending on how you look at the what they do sweep in, that could be available to use to take care of the state budget that we have, the state and capital budget. This becomes a political football because you got to have a 3/4 vote, 60, basically to get it passed within the House and the Senate is a 3/4 vote to tap into the CBR where they sweep this money into, and then it reverse sweeps back into the accounts they were taken from. This money is the power cost equalization, it could be scholarships, it could be a whole bunch of different things. There are a lot of useless programs that are no longer even active inside of the sweep that still have money sitting in them doing nothing but collecting dust. This is what we got to look at trying to get cleared up. I currently got on my phone here the other meeting, which is just about ready to begin. So I'm going to cut this off right here. And HB76 for the COVID relief emergency declaration that our governor has already declared is over with. They're trying to push this through in the House. They want it. They want that power and control over every penny and every decision that's ever going to be made from here on out for COVID, and basically take the control out of the executive branch's hands on whether or not our state is in an emergency. They could do everything they want to do just through normal statutes of appropriation and to fund these different things that they want to do for the $1.1 billion that is $1.2 billion that's coming into our state. Instead, they choose to, they're trying to declare the emergency declaration to appease those on the far left that still want to have these draconian mask mandates. You've heard that we've got 20% of Alaska has now been vaccinated, and everybody in the state is eligible to be able to go get vaccinated right now. So don't hesitate. There are no lines. I'm not seeing them anywhere. Your local pharmacies are able to give you the vaccination. Just call and set up an appointment with them, and they will take you. If you got any questions, go to the Alaskan website, and they got all the different locations that you can go out there and do this from. Looks like they're about ready to begin on the other one, so I need to shut this down and get the other one started up. Talk to y'all later.